Pete. So we're
Well,
right.
plus
So,
I didn't get the invite till just now. You guys aren't at work. I'm at work in the middle of the day. If you don't get me this hours ahead of time, I gotta know. So anyway, I'm here. I can do it. But
well,
I figured
we are excited to have you here. We are currently recording. And for those who are used to Mike and Darren Unplugged, you have the special treat of our third amigo, Peter S. Field. Peter is also guilty of being an American historian. He has written extensively in the early Republic and the antebellum period. Two very important books, one on the crisis of the standing order, about the decline of federalism and its cultural compensations, and an excellent study of Ralph Waldo Emerson as a public intellectual. It's written about Walt Whitman and is currently working on a very important work on Lincoln and the problem of friendship, both personal, but more importantly, political. So in addition to that, for our current conversation, Pete's the only one who's actually an expert. He is the Dean of Arts and Humanities, or head of school, but we call them deans on this side of the pond, in New Zealand, in Christchurch, at the University of Canterbury. So with that, we are very happy to have with us today, Dr. Field, Peter, we'll call him. We've known him long enough that we can do that. And so our question for today that we're going to be talking about for about 40 minutes is, what are the humanities? Where they come from? What's at their heart? And how is it put together? So I thought perhaps the best way the best person to start us here is the person who that's his job, and that's Dr. Field, Peter.
well, thank you for that introduction, which I certainly can't live up to. And Michael, good to see you.
It's nice to see you too.
Indeed, and I'm glad to say that we did share something recently too, as well as things in the ancient history, as Darren mentioned. And that was that we taught a class together that you helped to organize. And in many ways, that was one of the provocations for my thinking that we might chat with everyone, because you put together a course that, in fact, I think is very much a hallmark of you that I would call very much humanitarian or in the humanities. It goes across, as alas my bailiwick here at University of Canterbury, several disciplines. So while it's often the case that our auditors might think of disciplines, philosophy and sociology and English and history, it's clear to me that you're interested in poetics and philosophy and history, at least as we've organized the course that we taught, as opposed to being within a discipline. So I thought we might even start with you looking at why you went about it that way and what you think is behind having an interdisciplinary approach.
Wow. Okay. I'll take a crack at it. In practice, it's too often the case that things that are touted as being interdisciplinary are in fact non-disciplinary. In other words, just conceptually invertebrate. You put together a different collection of, or more or less a collage of ideas, and try and then find some way of sewing them together. Some collages work better than others, but that's what they're trying to do. I would disagree with that way of looking at it. I think that the disciplines only exist for the purposes of accountants at the university. In fact, there's only one thinking, and we distinguish them on the basis of what we're thinking about. Are we thinking about the world around us in a physical sense, or are we thinking about the world in a mental sense or a cultural sense? And in that sense, somebody like Hamlet is real, but not in the sense that it's physically real. It's an element, a landmark in our culture. And there are a lot of other such landmarks. And the reason why we study these in both history and philosophy and literature is because they educate your imagination at the same time that they educate your rational capacities. So it's a kind of gymnasium for all your faculties. And that's a sort of Aristotelian ideal where you identify the different capacities that you have and you get them all to a serviceable level of capacity. It's a little bit like owning a Swiss Army knife. Make sure that all the blades work reasonably well, and then you can polish up the other ones as you like. That's the way to think about the humanities. There are various ways of thinking about the natural world and various ways of thinking about the human world, but they're not in any fundamental sense at odds. In other words, chemistry can't be opposed to physics. Literature is not opposed to history or vice versa. Rather, they're two different ways of talking about the same or isomorphic ideas and structures. So, yeah, there's the human sciences and there are the natural sciences. And as the natural sciences are transformed and developed, the human sciences are also transforming and developing in a kind of sympathetic response.
So when we go into the library, for example, or your library behind you, it's interesting to think of the various ways that one could divide up or house collections of knowledge, right? And certainly we have disciplines, and that keeps us disciplined. But when I look around at the university behind me or the staff, I find that they seem to be, in fact, in camera or separated out, that there's fewer and fewer folks who have an aspiration that actually I find that the two of you have, and why I enjoy you so much is you at least have the aspiration of trying to grasp the whole, not to claim, though you might, Michael, Darren, of course you do, always claim that you know everything, but nevertheless to have the aspiration, I feel is sadly missing, which is I understand humility, and humility is a virtue, but there is something to be said for saying that there's still a great desire. And I wonder among our auditors if what they're not attracted to is the idea that at least you're trying to say, hey, I'm not just staying here. And then in fact, if you don't have some poetry, you don't have any philosophy. If you don't have some history and some empirical knowledge, then it doesn't matter whether you're going to define human. You're never going to get there. That you need to have some aspiration, especially in a world that now seemingly is so complex that we can't make sense of it, that young people can't find anyone who at least is giving it a go.
I mean, Darren, you want to take this one?
Sure. So there's a lot of ways to skin this cat. I'm struck by something Mike said about the reality of Hamlet. And I think that's appropriate. I mean, in a certain way, it runs in tension to the idea of the development of Geisteswissenschaft, of human sciences. And I think my personal feeling is the development of Geisteswissenschaft is in tension with humanistic education. What do I mean by that? I'm going to read to you, since you came up with it, I went right to the internet and pulled it out. The following quote from Hamlet. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. That strikes me as expressing an ideal, which I don't think is humanitarian at all. I think it's humanistic. And I think that's, in fact, one of the functions of the humanities, is to give us access to another set of high cultural values and of human values. And those are about not the happiness or well-orderedness of mankind, or even his flourishing, but about his nobility, his aspiration, almost Promethean-like.
That's right.
Towards ideals.
It's very Greek. It's very Greek. It's very anti-Augustinian.
Yeah, I know. I actually think it's anti-Augustinian. I think that's right, and I think it was also an essential part of what the Renaissance understood of being classic. Right.
That's
why
right.
it revived classicism was a way of reviving this idea of the nobility of the human.
That's where you get Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. Here we get an idealized human form.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's when I don't disagree with you, Mike, that we want to teach skills and train capacities. That's absolutely true, and the humanities does do that. But you don't need humanistic excellence to do that. You could do that with mediocrity and still teach people good writing and analytic skills.
You probably can, but I'm not just teaching skills. I'm teaching actually cultural content. Don't give me any of the Deweyan stuff where we're all going to learn how to solve problems. There's a
right. I think that was a throwaway for you, right? That wasn't the intention there at all. Because
well,
again, I think the idea is. Sorry, you go ahead.
Okay, take my throwaway and run with it, Peter. I think the 20th century analog to that beautiful aria in praise of human beings, reminds me of Vico in a way. The 20th century downside of that is after a night of fretful dreams, Gregor Samsa woke up and realized he was a bug. Yeah, you can take that to the bank. From angel to bug in about 400 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's interesting to see that itself, that piece of work is, of course, a humanist work, commenting on the degrading of humanity by one source. That's, in fact, been some of the richest literature of the 20th century was figures saying, the humanistic ideal is dying before us, and the dignity of man is dying before us. I mean, we always feel it's dying, so we're always singing that song. Doesn't mean it isn't. I'll give you another quote, and then I'll say, Peter, respond. And this quote is from 20th century. It is the speech of Mustafa Mond, or his thinking in Brave New World, when he eliminates.
Darren always has such good taste, doesn't he, Michael?
He does.
When he eliminates the an important new theoretical work, mathematical work on biology, showing the importance of purpose. He says, cannot publish, keep an eye on this guy, we may have to deport him. And then he says, it's actually brilliant, and it's probably true. But it's not our goal. He says, instead, the goal was somewhere beyond, somewhere outside the present human sphere, that the purpose of life was not the maintenance of well-being, but some intensification and refining of consciousness, some enlargement of knowledge, which was, the controller reflected, quite possibly true, but not in the present circumstances.
Well, we're certainly no less in the same state as today. It's not as if we've solved this problem. In fact, it's been intensified a great deal, hasn't it? And it's one of the interesting things. We've often played around thinking of where humanities comes from, or the humanitarian, as you might say it, or the human. And there's lots of definitions of human, right? Yeah. So free, rational, featherless, bipedal, whatever, right? And I think that we want to go for another one alternatively, right? Which I think Michael's always mentioned, which is humans have an ability to have self-consciousness. And self-consciousness, I think, is kind of where we want to go with this, that somehow we only have that. And engaging in the humanities is an ability, as it gives young people a chance to refine that, to refine their self-consciousness and ask themselves questions about themselves that you don't really get asked very much anywhere else. And what better way to do it than through some text? You've mentioned Shakespeare, you've mentioned Aristotle, we've gotten up to Brave New World, so Huxley will throw in there, that have stood the test of time. People are still reading Brave New World, and we're well on. People are still somehow or other finding recourse to going to book one of the Republic 2,500, 2,600 years later. There should be something in there.
Well, I think that's also part of what marks the humanities away from the Geisteswissenschaft. Geisteswissenschaft are about cutting edge. It's about what's new and a breakthrough. Whatever is new and a breakthrough in the enlargement of consciousness cannot be canonized for at least a generation, right? That's the key to the humanities. It is a brutally and ruthlessly meritocratic endeavor, and it is, you need to police to keep the mediocre out. You'll never do it perfectly. The canon is always going to shift. It should shift. It must shift.
Right.
But if it is shifting for any reason extrinsic to the humanities itself, then the humanities are in serious trouble.
Well, I thought we might talk about that maybe and put that off for maybe another
Okay.
short discussion.
Sure.
But it does seem that any discussion we have will be leading to that question of where is the humanities if the humanities is about the test of time and going slow in a world where things go faster and faster. Even the question of reading, which in itself takes time, or writing.
Well, you used an interesting word, and I think it's apt, and that is refine. And I think part of the ideal of humanistic education was to refine the character and tastes of the educated, to make them more cultivated. And I think that the idea behind that, maybe, nonsensical Western hegemonic BS, but maybe not, is that to be civilized is to be enriched by the humanities, to be edified by them, and to be refined. And the idea will be that not only will you have better judgments about a range of subjects, a range of great questions, not just justice and fairness, but truth and beauty and love. So not only that, but also by enlarging the mind, by opening the mind and exposing it to different periods and different cultures, to make it more cosmopolitan, we might say, or I would prefer to say more civilized and more cultivated, more, and this is really what I think has been the tension for the humanities, and when it started to feel a tension, is romanticism. It's really the opposite of the ideal of authenticity. It is to refashion yourself through the humanities and be a different person afterwards. And I think that's
those are a couple
part
of civilizing there.
Oh yeah,
right.
Mamie, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, Mike, you probably want to step in, but I'm going to ask you about your Greek for a moment. I'm trying to remember what aesthetic actually means, but I believe in Greek it means perception, Darren. Right. So that the idea is that when aesthetics is really a way of perceiving, right, of understanding, of refining.
It's also related to pleasure. So the aesthetic is connected to the pleasant and the pleasurable, right? So there's different kinds of aesthetic experience, some of them appealing to your brain, like reading a novel or listening to a symphony, others appealing to lower down. And both of them are properly aesthetic. It's just different levels of taste, a little bit like Mill talked about. Now, what Darren, when you were talking about what was the last thing you had?
Romanticism. He's trying to make an interesting, refined critique of the romantic movement.
Romanticism is a very ephemeral cultural construction, because it can't get by just on its own merits. There are things that it's going to have to do in a clear-sighted way. These are practical engagements with the world for which romantic engagement is not all that useful, right? It's one thing to agitate in antebellum America for abolitionism, but the hard work of actually freeing slaves is not the work of romantics. This is the work of grim men who have blood on their hands. All right. So I think that romanticism in America died with the Civil War, except in the South. There's a nostalgia for a lost innocence that goes all the way through to Uncle Remus and children's stories like Mark Twain's that are backward looking in the sense that they're nostalgic, and realism is purely a Northern phenomenon.
Peter?
I just want to note the aesthetic that Michael's almost holds up his beer as he tells us that aesthetic also has to do with other kinds of pleasures. So
there we go.
I hope you like what you're drinking. I hope it's good for you. Or good for that. I just want to go back to another point that Darren was making about cultivation. And part of cultivation is also memory, and that things last. And I think one of the key elements of humanities is what we want to ask ourselves, and of course ask our students, is to engage in looking at the past and recovering things and deciding through taste what's recoverable. And if memory somehow, to me, fundamentally relates, though I'm not sure how, to cognition. And so if you can't remember, then I think you can't think and you can't imagine.
Yeah.
And so trying to say that, okay, if there's something so wrong with the past, and I guess there is an element of romanticism, but there's something so we'll want to jettison the past because only now do we know what to do, or the people in the past have ruined things, so we only have now, then it seems we greatly impoverish ourselves. So that we're kind of making not a rear guard action, but an action for the present that argues that if you're going to imagine a future, you've got to think in the present. And in order to imagine and think well in the present about the future, you best be tied to something. And if it's not culture or Western culture, fine, then it can be world culture. I know I'm going on here. We discussed.
Let me stop you for a second. All right.
That's a pleasure.
I think that it's like Descartes' search for the perfect universal perspective. Look, there's no 0 point. Like Kierkegaard said, everybody has to start somewhere. You can be Chinese, you can be American, you can be an Argentinian, you can be a Saudi, but you have to start somewhere. And if you want access to high culture, the smart or the best route is access through your own tradition. So there's an awful lot of people that want to talk about global culture that don't know their own. So you start somewhere. You and I and Darren all started in American history, but we all studied many other histories and integrated them into a much larger perspective. And that was like the framework of a skyscraper into which we could introduce all the other reading in literature or philosophy or social policy and stick them in their appropriate places because they're organized around chronology, right? So it seems to me then that we are better off if we look to our own tradition, still showing respect to other traditions, but admit the fact that it's hard enough to learn your own, much less to learn all of them. And you can't start from everywhere. You got to start from somewhere. That's not intrinsically evil. That's just the human condition. We're finite.
Well, you guys are talking about two wonderful but slightly different things. They're connected. One is the desire to see to be the inheritors of a global cultural tradition. And as Mike points out, that's a lot to know. And you need to start from someplace. You need to start from home. That's right. And then the other, and which I think Peter was more sensitive to, is a sort of campaign against the past. Why should we learn about past things that are ugly and distasteful, that are traumatizing? And I would say again, they're both great questions, and they're you know, there's undoubtedly good arguments on all sides, but I think Mike hit the former. For the latter, I would say part of why we want to cultivate and expand our minds is to see what humans have been and have done so that we can know ourselves better. So one of the things I think that people get upset about is all of the trauma in the past. Mm-hmm. And there's no shortage of it. I mean, there's tons and tons of trauma. And, you know, if I may say, you know, going back to the Romanticism, I think Romanticism went through a fade back to positivism after the Civil War, as you point out, but it didn't go away. And boy, it's come back, and it's strong as ever. And it was strong in the 1960s, and it's strong in all of the, you know, folk movements, etc. And that's fine. I mean, you know, it's part of our humanistic tradition too. But I wonder if when we are traumatized and unwilling to confront things like the career of Temujin, if we aren't in fact impoverishing ourselves. One, he was a real human being. He really did big things. He was probably one of the most important people that ever lived on this planet. Two, you're offended because you're offended to know yourself. We all have Temujin in us. Every human who's ever lived. And everyone is like, well, it's full of past cruelty. Hey, you're an apex predator. You eat everything on this planet. Know yourself. If you deny that, you will not be able to refine yourself and cultivate yourself, and you will cause trauma. So my view is if students are traumatized by things, you've got to triple that. Because the only way to overcome trauma, in that case, if you're traumatized by reality, is to grow a real thick skin, because that's the world in which you live. And if you look away, you enable it to get worse.
I feel listening to you, Darren, I have to take my medicine. and of course you're right.
Right, though, yeah, it's clearly right.
But I think that we also want to emphasize something at the same time. And who am I to dissent? I certainly don't. But when we think of what we want to assign and what we, with our taste, want to extract from the past in terms of the great thinking, the great literature, the great poetry, the great philosophy, and even you started with Hamlet, and you read an upbeat little soliloquy from Hamlet, but I don't think it's entirely upbeat. I think a fair number of people die. In fact, everybody's dead by the end of Hamlet, lying across it. Is there something remarkably redeeming in Hamlet? That I would urge every adolescent to read Hamlet many times and come out of it much better and actually feeling improved. And so there's an astonishing thing in reading chapter 3 of the Peloponnesian Wars, which is just dreadful, and yet coming out with hope. Or even contemporary. We don't have to always go back to think about the humanities. One can read a novel, which I think Michael had mentioned in a previous episode, Blood Meridian, by Cormac McCarthy. And I would recommend that to absolutely anyone. Not that the book contains moral stories. It's amoral in the most horrific way. And yet after one finishes it and walks around the book and one's experience of it, you don't only get your medicine, Darren. I think one is genuinely uplifted.
Yeah.
Because once one walks through the graveyard and comes out, I think one can feel things about humans surviving and thriving despite what rough beast.
Yep.
And that, I think, is equally, or more important in what we feel we're doing as pedagogues and trying to hold on to something that we find wonderful, in fact, redeeming.
Okay, no, I don't disagree with that. The only word I probably would have an issue with is hope, not because you use it inappropriately, but because it's been overused and used dangerously, which is, you're exactly right. The following words after that speech in Hamlet are, you know, but I don't feel this way. It's filthy dust to me. And that juxtaposition is powerful because it shows that complicated sense of, yes, I know humans are this wonderful thing, and yet I loathe them. And that context creates a tension. And in that tension emerges this really weird thing called a soul or a self. And I think the people who want happy Hollywood endings are infantilizing us.
Yes.
And they're taking our souls.
We agree here. I know, Mike, it's your turn, but I'm going to chime in and say that's right, because anyone who's giving or offering a happy ending, in fact, has a dark soul or no soul at all, because they feel that's what their fellow people need, and we don't. It's nonsense. We can take our medicine because we've seen what's inside and we know what's wonderful. So why would you give anyone a happy ending?
So just to sing some praises, the light of hope is Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And if you want to see someone understand that appropriately, it's true though. You want to see someone?
I'm just looking at Michael, who's just cringing. You can't bring it up without a cringe.
He's a curmudgeon. We let him be. Drink from your horn. But Pete's done wonderful work on that. But this is what I mean by having that big soul. Pete's now working on Lincoln, and the Lincolnian vision is much darker, right? I mean, he sees a much more complicated world where you're not going to get everything you want. You may get some things, and you're going to have to make adult, hard decisions. You cannot do that without that larger humanistic perspective. If you do, they're all going to be instrumental. They're going to be like, oh, how do I solve this problem now and that little problem there? And then the next thing you know, you've designed the world of League of Nations and self-determination of people and killed about 20 million people.
Well, you go very fast.
You couldn't think.
For our auditors, but it's a wonderful point, Darren. It's an absolutely wonderful point. That is that who can blame people who are looking for reasons to, whose eyes are open, who see the suffering around them, who are suffering. And where do they find some meaning for that suffering? Well, some refined taste will help them. So for the likes of all of the Whitmans and Emersons, you have to engage with the Melvilles, right? And the Poes. And in their own way, they're redeeming, because.
And what humanities does is it gives you both. It gives you that conversation, that tension. And when it's well experienced, you are forced to, when you read Peter Field on Emerson, appreciate, right, the greatness that was Emerson.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you don't also appreciate the greatness that was Lincoln or Melville or Haythorne. And that's what it is to be a humanist, is to see both sides, alpha and omega, the whole deal, to see, yeah, the Greeks, great.
In that sense, it's an interesting question for both of you. Would you characterize yourselves in your own way as sort of deeply melancholic, and that it is your deep melancholy that enables you in some way to be a teacher, to reach into your own experience, which is to find meaning? And the more melancholic and the deeper the dark side, the harder one has to plumb and the deeper one has to plumb to find that redemption and that meaning, and look for fellows and fellow travelers in the Melvilles or the Socrateses or the Kierkegaards or the Lincolns.
That's actually a great question. What does it say? I think it's in some of the wisdom literature in the Bible. With much knowledge comes much sorrow.
That's Solomon. Yeah.
Solomon, that would be him, yeah.
Right.
And you become more attuned to the frustrations and ironies and difficulties, I believe, of the world. That's my best understanding. And that's nothing is free. It's part of the price you pay for being able to make what sense can be derived from the wisdom of learning your limitations. Dostoevsky says somewhere that suffering is the origin of all consciousness. Well, you have to find a way of treating the suffering you've encountered in life, and we've all encountered it, like those little grains of sand they put in pearl oysters, and you throw level after level after level of stuff over it that your mind somehow secretes, and you turn something awful into the most valuable part of you, because in fact, this saves your life, and you produce something completely unexpected, because as far as I know, oysters aren't supposed to do this. They just happen to have this accidental quality. And I think there's something there for us to learn.
Yeah, I would say, I don't know that I would use the word melancholic. If melancholy is the absence of being happy-go-lucky, then yeah, okay, melancholic. But as I said, I'm pushing towards the dark, as you say, but not because I think the dark is better, but because I think right now, I mean, in my mind, I'm being dialectical. We can't face it. And so, I'm going to push you there. If we were in a moment of darkness, I'd push you towards the light. Not because one is right and one is wrong. They're both absolutely necessary and unavoidable. And part of enlarging your perspective, of building yourself up, of edifying, is to see both and to be both. And, when people, to me, this is the difference in Geisteswissenschaft and humanism. Is the Geisteswissenschaft is looking for, well, what is the right posture towards being? And the humanities are saying there are many postures towards being. Try them out. See what works. You decide. You may not decide to come up with a global answer. You may decide to come up with, this is where I'm going to be gloomy, Gus. On the next day, at this moment, it's appropriate to be something else.
So if we put this in
the
vocabulary,
without having the toolkit. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. If we say final vocabulary, Michael, it sounds like Richard Rorty's come and joined us, doesn't it? Right? That we're all looking for our final vocabulary. God help us, right?
Like
my sense is that there is, the great paradox in the humanities and the long story, and it's the Socratic one, and it's an answer in some way to the Delphic injunction too, which is everything I know teaches me really one thing, which is I don't know.
Yeah.
And this quest, it may not be melancholic. I'm with you. I kind of like to maybe move away from that. But nevertheless, the quest that the more one knows, and I won't lie, I feel that Michael, among others, probably knows quite a lot more than I do, and that and we both do, but we're working at it, right? We're working at it. We'll catch up. If he dies soon, then we'll catch up, right? No, never
Maybe.
will. That no one greater than the two of you, in my experience, has reminded me how little I know, and what a wonder that is, and how fantastic that is, and how meaningful it is that occasionally you can encounter folks who spend their whole lives plumbing the depths. And every now and again, they come up for air laughing. And what are they laughing at? What are you guys laughing at? Why are we enjoying this? I feel you're enjoying this, not so much because of the suds, which Darren's not drinking, but because you have to laugh at yourself, because you realize the only thing we're certain of is that the world is definitely not made of the world, to take Cormac McCarthy's line of something I've recently read. The only thing we can be sure of is, as we're looking at things, that we don't even have the vocabulary to actually step outside them and understand them, much less ourselves. And that's funny. That's the comedy. That's not tragic. It's not melancholy.
In fact, I didn't want to say this, but if you asked for my disposition, it's ultimately, I think my disposition is ultimately comic, which is when I see my big vision of history is, for the most part, what a curious species man is. He chooses to learn almost nothing from anything. He's constantly in conflict with himself, entirely because of mistaken and confused inputs, right?
Spinoza, get ready.
Well, but look, we got how many centuries of war between Christendom and Islam, and still a struggle between the West and the Levant. And yet, I mean, from a big comic perspective, You're two brothers fighting. You're both Western. You
That's
both come from the Greeks, and you both come from Jerusalem. So I'm sorry, I have to take a call really quickly.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. You want to go to
couldn't
8?
be more, couldn't be more
Yes,
right about that. And anyway, maybe we have to wrap things up pretty soon. But my sense again here is,
Okay, guys,
Yep. Got to wrap things up.
I gotta
Go ahead,
run.
Doctor.
I'll catch you guys later.
All right. Talk to you tomorrow.
And we will plan for another.
All right. Yes.
we will.
Okay, does tomorrow night work at the same time for you, Pete?
It does.
Yes, I think I'll make it work.